Okay, welcome everybody to the MRCA Sharp Safety Certification webinar. And we'd like to thank you for coming. My name is Megan Miller, and I am the Managing Director for the Midwest Roofing Contractors Association. I'm filling in for Morgan today. She is out with our Ohio Roofing Contractors Association at their golf outing. So glad to have those guys getting back together. Today's topic is roofing fall protection, and our speaker today is Chris Paulin of RST Services. Chris Paulin has over 40 years experience in the construction industry with a bachelor's degree in construction management and English literature from the Connecticut State University. So I will go ahead and hand this over to Chris so we can get started.
Hi all, can you hear me? Everybody okay? If you can't, just raise a hand. I am going to share a screen with you now. Okay, if you should all see a screen that has fall prevention, a company logo on it, and I assume everybody can hear okay, so we're going to move along. I was asked by NAFIS Mitchell Rays to provide some specific information for you today. And that generally has to do with the management of fall protection as opposed to how to teach fall protection to a guy. One of the things I've discussed with NAFIS is this. If you go and take an OSHA 10 class or an OSHA 30 class, nobody teaches you anywhere how to manage safety. If you're a company owner or if you're a safety manager for a company, it's really very likely that you've just had to learn this on your own. And some of the things that we want to do in this seminar is to provide you information that you can have for reference and to engage you about a couple of specific items that we think it's important that you be aware of. We'll be covering OSHA concerns and trends, the general duty clause, fall prevention, programs and training, management's responsibilities, and some of the financial impacts of fall prevention. And we say fall prevention, not fall protection, because this is what we do before people get on a roof. Now, OSHA has some concerns, and if you look at OSHA, OSHA's mandate is labor law, emphasis on law. It's not a recommendation, it's a legal requirement. And that legal requirement puts virtually all of the burden on the companies that employ laborers. It's OSHA's mission and their primary concern to reduce workplace injuries and fatalities. It's your responsibility to make sure that your people are trained so that they are aware of the dangers that they would face when they're working. Now, OSHA has periodic programs to address what they think is important. They will come and inspect job sites to ensure compliance. And to that end, in 2021, OSHA has a budget of $591 million. I'm sorry, $591 million, that's correct. That is for compliance and enforcement. There are about 2,100 OSHA inspectors, and it turns out to be a little under $300,000 a guy for each person that they put in the field. And that's federal OSHA. There are 28 OSHA state plans, and every state that is a state plan state has additional inspectors over and above the ones that OSHA federally puts out. OSHA is responsible for programs on all federal job sites. So if you're at a military base in Ohio or in Texas, you work under federal OSHA. If you're on a federal building like a courthouse, you work under federal OSHA, even if it's in a state plan state. State plans tend to modify local plans, usually not, state plans tend to modify federal plans, usually not by much, but usually when they do modify them, the modification is more rigorous. Now, in 2019, because the 2020 statistics aren't published yet, there were a total of 33,393 federal inspections and a little over 42,000 state plan inspections. So these guys are out there looking. But if you remember something that's important, you've still got a finite number of inspectors to inspect all the companies and all the workers in the United States. So if you've got 350 million people in the United States and 2,100 federal inspectors, you pretty much have to do things to call attention to your project in order to have an inspector come. What we want to do is advise you of some of the things that are most common. Now, in 2019, 5,333 workers died on the job. You hear about very little of that in the news because it happens all the time. Roughly 20% of the people that are injured and die in the construction industry. It's a huge number of people, but statistically, the percentages are going down. The number increases, but because the population has increased, the percentage of accidents, injuries, and fatalities is declining on a percentage basis. That still means we lose hundreds of people every year. And hundreds of people is hundreds too many. There is a $130 billion annual cost to businesses for OSHA accidents. That means people getting hurt, lost time, people dying, the insurance ramifications of all that cost American companies $130 billion a year. In worker fatalities, 338 out of 1,008 total deaths in 2018, or 33.5%, were construction fatalities. And most of those were roofers. You have struck by objects, you have electrocutions, and you have caught in between. That's what they call that fatal four. Fatal four is something that everybody that takes an OSHA 10-hour or OSHA 30-hour class should be familiar with. When we look at, again, the federal coverage is all of the United States. The MRCA has contractors in regions 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So you guys are spread all over the place. And for one association to say uniformly across the board, the rules are this and that, it really varies from region to region and state plan to state plan. So where you are, you have to be cognizant of the local rules. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Region 2 activity, which includes Ohio, according to the map that I was provided by OSHA. And one of the Region 2, I get these notices all the time. They just like to say what they found wrong. And there was a contractor last year in Pennsylvania, $605,000 worth of fines for exposing his employees to fall hazards at 3 Pennsylvania sites. Okay? I get this in Region 3, 2, 4, and sometimes Region 1. It's literally millions of dollars worth of fines that are unnecessary. And the way these fines stack up is significant. When you look at the violations that can occur if somebody's not following the law, if an inspector goes on a job and he finds one guy not following the law, meaning something like not tied off, or one guy on a roof when the ladder's in front of a door, he can fine you up to $13,653. That's per violation. It's probably not going to happen the first time, but I guarantee you the second or third time he's back on the job, you're going to get whacked with the maximum. And that's per occurrence, which means if you have 6 guys on a project and there's one ladder in front of a doorway, you could be subject to $13,653 6 times, one for each guy that's on the job. I've met a number of OSHA inspectors over the years. They have always said to me, if they want to look, they can find something. And because nobody's perfect, all we have to do is, you know, look at anybody's job site and we can find something wrong. And the idea here is not to nitpick anybody. The idea is to help create a culture where everybody that you work with is cognizant of what can happen. You know, OSHA protects the worker. Who protects the company? Well, that's part of this meeting right here. But we need to speak with your workers about, you know, their responsibilities as well. It is a two-way street. Just like you're obligated to provide fall prevention equipment, they're obligated to use it. Now, in general, we talk about the rules of construction, and all this is going to be made available to you. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there are specific rules that relate to you working on a job with other contractors. Many of you guys are familiar with this. It goes to the theme of multi-employer work sites, how they decide who is responsible for what. Basically, you know, you can be a creating, exposing, correcting, or controlling contractor. If a guy works for you and he's on a job where something's wrong, no matter who is wrong, you're the exposing contractor because they work for you. So you have an obligation to your job site and your people and your company to bring anything that's wrong up with whoever's running the job. If it's a construction manager and there's no protection over holes in the floor, you're technically exposing your people when they walk by those holes. It's in the floor, it's not in the roof, but you're a roofer. So you have to be cognizant of the fact that even though it's not your problem, it could be your problem. And we want you to be aware of that. We're going to give you the specific rules regarding these multi-employer work sites, okay? And everybody should be aware. Creating employer is the one that makes the problem. The exposing employer is who the people on the job work for. The correcting employer is the one that makes the changes, and the controlling employer is probably the one who's handling the money and paying for everybody to make whatever changes need to be made. Sometimes it's the GC who's also responsible for the safety on the job overall. Now, contractors can have multiple roles. Just because you didn't create a problem doesn't mean you're not exposing your people, and it doesn't mean you can't be the guy that corrects the problem. And if you're the controlling contractor on a job and everybody's working under your prime contract, you have to be aware that people work for you, people work for other people, subs to you, and as a controlling contractor, you have responsibility not only to your own guys, but the subcontractors that work for you as well. Now, all that's going to be given to you in the copy so you can read it if you're interested in the details of it. There are emphasis programs from OSHA. There are national emphasis programs where OSHA goes to all the federal inspectors and says they want to do certain kinds of things. There are also local emphasis programs. The local emphasis programs are the things that are going to contact you and your people in the field directly. The local emphasis programs are always supposed to be accompanied by outreach from the local regional office, from the regional OSHA office, not the local. If it's a state outreach, then it's a state that's supposed to, be reaching out to you. If it's a federal plan state, then, the outreach is available through the federal regional office. And there are local offices all over the place. For example, Pennsylvania has 6 local offices in the state. Now, in Region 2 alone, which is Ohio, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, there are 6 local emphasis programs. Falls in construction is almost always an emphasis program in every region. And you'll find noise hazards, powered industrial trucks, lead abatement. Um, this is just for 2019. Now, everybody has a responsibility. They're going to try and draw to your attention that there are certain emphasis programs. A couple of years ago was a major emphasis on silica, and all the people that had to make modifications to their work because of a revision to the rules in handling silica sand and respiratory crystalline diseases. Now, there are two ways that OSHA laws are handled. One of them is specifically with the rules that fall into the subparts, but generally, there's a general duty clause that affects every single contractor. It's also every single business. And when we talk about OSHA in this program, we're talking about 1926 for construction, not 1910 for general industry. 1910 for general industry affects what you guys do in your shop. 1926 affects what you do in the field. And there are differences. And 1910 for general industry may say to you that you have a 4-foot requirement for fall prevention in your building. But when you get to your job out in the field, 1926 says it's 6 feet. It's not the same everywhere. So you need to check both your general industry requirements and your federal OSHA requirements for construction to make sure that you're doing the right thing in the right place. Now, each employer has a responsibility under the general duty clause, and that's to furnish a place of employment that's free from hazards and to comply with the standards under the OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Each employee has an obligation to comply with those rules. It's supposed to be a two-way street. Unfortunately, the fine is one way from OSHA to the employer. It's up to the employer to enforce the employee's compliance. I know that they can't go after each individual employee who walks around dragging a lifeline that's not connected to an anchor point. That's really the responsibility of your company and your personnel in the field to monitor not only themselves but each other. The general duty clause is there to remind you that everybody has a responsibility. And the general duty clause applies when there's no specific OSHA standard, meaning if something's not right, they couldn't really capture everything in black and white and make a law about it. But if there's something that doesn't appear to be correct, you can have a general duty clause violation just because you failed to keep a record about something or you didn't train somebody about a hazard. These are all specific items that can be referred to in some ways, and in some ways it's a little nebulous. But when we talk about low slope roofing, and steep slope has a couple of different requirements. Roofing work on low slope work is covered by a number of laws. Section M of OSHA 1926 is fall prevention. We're going to talk a little bit about these fall prevention items. I'm going to give you the exact wording, which is what comes in these slides, but we won't spend a lot of time dwelling on it. Now, holes, walking working surfaces. You are responsible for making sure that the surfaces your employees walk on are safe. And ordinarily, we can take a look and say the deck does not appear to be compromised, the holes are covered up, everything's fine, we can clear our people to go to work in an area. Sometimes you may have to take a step back if the deck looks to be compromised. And if the deck looks to be compromised, you may need to evaluate the walking working surface before you put your people on it. Now, there's one thing that happens quite a lot, and that's a mistake regarding the use of safety monitors and warning lines on roofs of 50 feet or less in width. That means the shorter of the two runs. You're allowed to use a safety line, a warning line and a safety monitor. If it's bigger than 50 feet wide, you have to use something else. Now, we'll talk about that in a bit, but I wanted to draw this to your attention because this part about, about warning lines and safety monitors gets abused all the time. You think if you put up a warning line, everything is going to be okay. And what you're doing actually is creating a controlled access zone around the leading edge of the building. So everybody that's inside the warning line can work freely, and everybody that's outside of the warning line is in a controlled access zone, and they have to have conventional fall protection. That only applies to buildings that are less than 50 feet in width, okay? Now, steep slope roofs, the ruling on steep slope roofs is not that you can wear a harness and connect a lifeline, okay? The law says, in black and white, or in blue and white in this case, each employee on a steep slope roof with unprotected sides and edges 6 feet or more above lower levels shall be protected from falling by guardrail systems with toe boards. That's not a harness. There is a hierarchy of controls. And actually, when you look at the law, we're pointing this out to you because this is exactly what the law says. Now, I do a fair amount of training of guys. I know that there's resistance to harnesses and lifelines and things like that. And by following the rule with guardrail systems and toe boards, you can just eliminate any pushback you get from guys that don't want to wear a harness. Walking working surfaces we touched on already, but you have to make sure that they have the structural integrity to support both the people and the materials that you're going to load onto the roof. That's equipment, material, and personnel. Unprotected sides and edges on a low slope roof, if you can fall more than 6 feet in construction, you have to take steps from falling, okay? Guardrail systems, safety nets, or personal fall arrest systems. Now, there is a rule about what you use, and that's called the hierarchy of controls. We'll get to that in just a minute. Hoist areas, every employee that can be subjected to a fall in a hoist area where you have to move railing systems away from the edge to allow materials to be put onto the floor or the roof, those employees have to be tied off. They have to wear a lifeline. So they can't just, move the railing aside, pull the load in, and then put the railing back. While that entire operation is occurring, they have to be tied off. One of the other things that guys don't always take into account is the ground, because it's not just people falling, it's also falling objects. So if you've got a hoist area, the ground underneath your hoist area has to be a controlled access zone. That controlled access zone will prohibit people from coming underneath the load you're lifting, so that if something does fall, it won't hit anybody on the ground. Now, penetrations, everybody knows. Every walking working surface has to have protection for the penetrations in the surface. So if there are holes, skylights, hatches, all these things need to be covered up and protected. And each employee on a walking working surface has to be protected not only from falling through, but from objects that can fall through. So somebody underneath the areas that you're working has to be protected. So a guardrail around an open skylight may not be sufficient when it comes to protecting the person below where you're working. okay? It could be an electrician, it could be somebody else, but it's one of the things that you need to consider because you have to read the law as if it's a law. It's not really subject to that much interpretation. It's black and white and it says that you must do certain things. So, having said that, I've been asked to talk about training a little bit. Everybody knows that the General Duty Clause requires that you make your employees aware of the hazards that they might face on a day-to-day basis. You're required to have a safety program and your employees are required to follow it. You're required to provide a safe workplace. This is the law. You're required to provide necessary training to employees, and you need to retain the documentation that proves you did the training. There's something that you'll find in this presentation over and over again, and that's if you didn't write it down, you didn't do it, okay? And one of the important things about that is this. If you tell your employees to do something and you write it down, then if something happens and they're following your instructions, it's an accident. But if you've got it written down and something happens and they're not following your instructions, then they are negligent. And that's a very important concept. It's important for me too, because when I tell you things, if I tell you that, this is what you're required to do, then I'm responsible. So when you say to your employees, they have to wear a harness and be tied off to an anchor and an appropriate anchor, and they don't do it, you have to have the documentation, because if they fall, you need to be able to prove that they, to the extent possible, are negligent and it's not you. Failing to have the documentation regarding training is just one more thing that they can charge you $13,653 per man for. And most of the time, these big fines have a very large component in them of fine for lack of training. Most of the time when I train guys, it's because I get called in because a guy's got big fines that he has to deal with. And most of the time that goes to improper training, failure to train, failure to keep the documentation. Now, management's commitment to employee involvement is absolutely essential here. You got to have your people in the field buy in. If they haven't bought in on the program, then you might as well be talking to the wall. And they need to understand, if you give them equipment, you teach them how to do it, you create a system that requires them to do it, and they fail to do it, then as an individual, they're negligent. Personally, when I train a guy, I give him a hold harmless agreement that says, if I tell you to do it, don't sue me if you don't. Because, we're in the United States and people just seem to think they can, hit the lottery when little things happen. And the fact of the matter is it's not right. It doesn't protect your company. It doesn't go a long way to protect the individuals that work for you. They need to understand that they can be negligent as well. Now, safety programs and training, what level of training should your guys have? Most guys put their people through an OSHA 10 class. That gives you 2 hours of fall prevention. In OSHA 30, 4 hours of fall prevention, sometimes 5 or 6, depending upon the individual instructor. There are 4 levels of fall prevention training. Awareness level training is all you get when you put a guy through an OSHA 10. He's just aware that he's got to do it. There's nothing in an OSHA 10 class that shows him how to correctly fit a harness, how to connect a harness. There's no hands-on component at all in an OSHA 10. And a lot of times there's not even a test, because the reality is, and it surprised me, is the only requirement is that a guy has his butt in a chair and that somebody signs and certifies and says he was there for the entire class. You don't even have to make sure he understands. If you're an instructor, butt in chair, you were there, I could give you a card. That doesn't happen where I come from. We test guys. But this awareness level training is very important. And the reason awareness level training is important is because it's not enough. You cannot make a guy aware, legitimately aware of fall prevention hazards in a 2-hour program in an OSHA 10 class. That Fatal 4 has a 2-hour requirement, and that's all. So the next level of training is authorized user training. This is the second level and something that every one of your guys should have. That means probably about 4 hours worth of classroom and a half a day to go through and physically demonstrate the hands-on components to the fall prevention systems that you're using. If they're railing systems or cable systems, mobile fall protection carts, personal fall arrest systems, whatever it is that you use, and authorized user training really needs to include those components. I do authorized user training. Most guys, they seem to think that awareness leveling is enough. It really covers you, okay? And it only really covers you with that general duty clause that says you made them aware of the hazard. It doesn't really do any good for you. Awareness level training doesn't do any good for you when it comes to teaching your guys how to be safe. They need to understand the correct way to fit a harness. Most guys understand the D-ring goes in the middle of the back. They don't understand that the harness doesn't fit correctly if the chest strap doesn't fall in the middle of their chest. So, even in videos across the country, we see harnesses that are misadjusted, too loose, and a guy could be hurt worse by hitting a harness during a fall that's improperly adjusted than he would be if he just fell. On a smaller fall, on a lower fall, he might be better off. An improper harness can do a lot of damage to a guy. Whiplash injuries. They have what they call suspension trauma, which is the impact the guy will feel in his legs and in his shoulders when he gets hit by that harness. So the harness needs to absolutely fit correctly. And because of all the different body types and sizes, compliance in a can where everybody gets the same harness really isn't the best way to go. If you're a full-time roofer and this is your profession and not your job, you want to have equipment where the guy who's wearing the equipment absolutely feels safe. And authorized user training will help a guy feel safer in the equipment if he knows exactly how it works. Not, a 5-minute YouTube video. But if he's actually put his hands on it, been instructed how to use it, been instructed how to fit it correctly, had the wrong size harness taken off of him and the right size harness put on him, all that will improve the user's comfort level with using the equipment, and consequently, a more comfortable worker who feels safer is one who works better. Now, the third level of fall prevention training is competent person training. Competent person training for fall prevention is a 3-day class. You have to know fall prevention plans, all the different kinds of systems. You have to be able to set them up. You have to be able to work with the design of the system. It really is a very involved program. And it really does take 24 hours worth of training to do. It's a full day of hands-on work to make sure that not only does the guy know how to wear a harness himself, but he knows how to fit other people with it, knows how to select the correct equipment. It's not all cookie cutter stuff. And, compliance in a can is pretty much cookie cutter. There's so many different body shapes out here. I would venture only a small percentage of guys actually fit correctly in a basic harness. And the last level of training is qualified person training. That includes engineering and the mathematics you need to know to design anchorage systems. The anchorage system is the place where most people in our industry fail. They have the harness, they have the lifelines, but the anchors are not connected correctly, or they're not using the right kind of anchor for the substrates that they're on. There are so many different kinds of anchors. We can spend a day on anchorage alone. You have mobile anchors, you have fixed anchors, you have anchors that attach to horizontal beams, vertical beams, other kinds of structural elements. There's so many different ones from a variety of manufacturers that you have to know how to be able to pick the correct one and then install the correct one and use it correctly. Question mark? Okay. Now, there are several things in the OSHA requirements, in the law, that specifically address what is required, okay, regarding training. A competent person must know how to recognize fall hazards and what procedures to follow to minimize or correct any situation that he's not familiar with or that's not compliant. You have to, training must address how to inspect, erect, disassemble, and maintain fall prevention equipment. I will tell you, probably 9 out of 10 guys don't know that there's a tag on the inside of every harness that is a calendar. It's once a month, and the harness is supposed to be inspected once a month by a competent person. The tag on the inside is a calendar where you're supposed to check off those inspections. It's a big deal. If you had a guy fall and the harness didn't fit correctly and he got very hurt, all these things are going to become part of the review, not just for OSHA, but for your insurance company as well. And if the harnesses aren't inspected, the lifelines aren't inspected, and these things are not properly documented, then your company is exposed to a potential in fines that it's just not worth it when we take the time to teach the guys to do things correctly. Now, for all practical purposes, maybe that competent man is your foreman, okay? At the very least, all equipment needs to be inspected once a month by the competent man, and it needs to be documented. So on day 1 of every month, the guy takes the time, he inspects hoses, regulators, extension cords, power tools, and fall protection equipment, ladders, whatever you have that you've brought for equipment on a job. Somewhere in your record on a 30-day basis, you have to have in black and white that a competent person inspected things. Now, is there a competent person for, circular saws and hand drills? Not really. But your foreman will qualify by virtue of his experience on the job. What he needs to be trained in is that there's a form and information that needs to be provided on a monthly basis and retained for your records in the future. And then the last part about this is that retraining is required when somebody shows that they don't understand what they were supposed to do, or conditions or equipment change. That retraining is mandatory. If you catch somebody not following the rules, then you as an employer have an obligation to take them back off the roof, sit them down and train them again until he does understand. And I know that I've worked with guys they've just been hard cases. They're not going to follow the rules. And at some point in time, if you have an employee that's not going to follow the rules, maybe he's not the best employee for you. Maybe he needs to go out and work for himself. But I would say that if he wants to keep a job and be a part of a team and work for a company that's a growing company and a healthy company, then he's going to do what he's asked to do. And then you as an employer must certify this by documenting it in accord with 29 CFR 1926.503, certification of training. It's a law. You have to keep the records of it. Somebody dies for whatever, God forbid, bad reason on a job, There is a law that says you must have had training for the guy and you have to keep the records. So this is not a joke, okay? And I know the attorneys that work with the Midwest Roofing Contractors Association are all over this kind of stuff because it's a law. And everybody wants you to do it correctly. Nobody wants to see a company exposed. Now, there are specific training requirements and a training program, okay? You actually have to have in place a training program for all the hazards that your people would face. That would include hazardous materials, solvents, adhesives, sealants, fuel. If you're doing hot air welding, you're using gasoline on a job. Your people need to be trained about this. You have to have hazardous materials information handy for every one of them. There's an entire program and process that gets put together to protect the employee, and consequently protecting the employee protects the company. And if we take the steps to protect the company by enforcing these rules, then the employee gets protected as well. So it's a two-way street, and it's always a two-way street. Now, the nature of fall hazards, there are a variety of things. Guardrail systems, personal fall arrest systems, safety nets, all these items, if they're in play on any of your projects, then you have to train to them. And I'm going to show you a slide in a couple minutes here about what comes first and what comes second. Okay? Competent person is required to do the training. And ordinarily, that competent person is somebody who's at least attended a 24-hour fall prevention class. You have to have credentials. What makes a qualified or competent trainer? There's requirements for this. Now, certification we've talked about. But these things that are in this presentation, this is the law. So if you've got any questions about it, you can download the presentation. You can look and see what it says exactly. This is copied and pasted. I didn't type it in and make it up, okay? It's copied and pasted for you to review, so you don't have to go onto the OSHA website and dig it out yourself. It's not necessary. It's a shortcut for you as a safety manager or a company owner. Now, ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, recommends training every 2 years. As an employer, you have the discretion to shorten or lengthen the time between instruction. Should you go more than 3 years? Probably not, okay? Anytime you make a change to the systems that you're using, you need to retrain. Every time you have new employees come on, you need to train them before they go up on your job, okay? And after initial training, OSHA considers an employee trained unless he or she demonstrates incompetence or the environment or equipment changes. So you really only need to train them once, but you probably ought to take a look at what they retain and the culture around it, and retraining improves the culture. And I know that there's companies that have a fantastic safety culture. They're all over it. Everybody's fine. No, everybody goes to work every day. They go home at the end of the day and come back to a safe job site tomorrow. The individual employees need to understand that you're there for them, not just today, but for tomorrow as well. And they need to be there for you at the same time. Now, what are the most important criteria for selecting a trainer? Language is number one. If you have Spanish-speaking employees, you have to train them in Spanish. I know all the time, because most of what I do is Spanish language training. I ended up living in Firestone, living in Mexico when I worked for Firestone for 6 years. And most of the time, they just you tell them things in English and they go, and they don't understand a damn word you're saying. It's just the reality of life. Most of those guys are lucky to have finished 3rd grade. Where they come from, they're hard workers, they're smart guys. They're not particularly well educated, And nobody wants to be embarrassed by saying they don't understand. They will go, yes. I see this when I try to give written tests to people who speak Spanish. They speak perfectly well, and they even understand some spoken English. They can't read and they can't write. Their name, that's it. So you can't even administer a written test to a guy that's a Spanish speaker. You have to test him orally to make sure that he understands. You got to look me in the eye, and I need to feel that the guy understood what I told him. Certification is important. Having a competent man just say he's a competent man without something to substantiate that will undercut the credibility of your program if something happens. And then you want guys with industry experience. You want people that have talked to other roofers or have grown up in the roofing trade. There are straight up safety guys without roofing experience that I wonder how it is they do what they're supposed to do. It's all by rote. They don't really understand how come the guy's doing something different. There are plenty of guys with industry experience. There are plenty of guys that speak Spanish. There are plenty of guys that are certified. Make sure that you have all three if you've got a Spanish-speaking crew, and that he's at least certified with industry experience for your English-speaking crews. Because if a guy works primarily with carpenters, he's not going to know what a fall cart is, a mobile fall protection cart. They may have never even seen that, okay? I've known, I do know, other safety guys. And when I ask them, what do you do about this? And I show them a mobile cart, they don't know what to do. I end up working with other safety guys because of this. Because this is my profession. I work in the roofing industry. And we see things that they may not. Now, you have to keep records of training. The document should include the names of the participants, the standards, the specific OSHA 1926 dot whatever standard, and copies of written exams if they're taking them, okay? If they're not taking them, it's just, you know, like my word. I said, okay, he took the class. But realistically, you want to see if you can come up with some kind of backup to prove that the guy understood what you intended him to learn. And if you don't write it down, it didn't happen, okay? You can say all day long, you inspected it, you inspected it, you inspected it. But if you didn't write it down, you didn't do it. And any attorney is going to tell you that. Now, just remember, that's probably the most important takeaway, is always writing down the little things that even to the level of the foreman on your job, maybe it helps to create a checklist that includes the things, so all he has to do is circle it yes, no, or check it off, yes, it's been done. We actually did that for the MRCA's version of the CERTA inspection form, and a copy of that is available to you. It includes the basic fall prevention things that your guys should be checking off every single day. Now, it's not all inclusive, but it's a head start. When we talk about falls, these are real photographs, okay? Guys falls, they get hurt. When they fall, they get hurt. And it's not just a guy falling, it's things that can fall off. There are all types of fall hazards. They include slips and trips. Almost all fall hazards can be completely eliminated by taking the proper steps to address the hazard. Now, site safety is a complicated issue, especially when you have multi-employer job sites. But you're always responsible for your own safety. And to that end, there's an activity hazard analysis that you would do. This is something we teach the competent men, how to complete a hazard analysis so they know what it is they're providing safety for. You must provide PPE. Everybody knows this. You know, if a guy's working for you, you have to give him the PPE. What they neglect is to make the monthly inspection of the PPE that's required. I know I work with a couple of large GCs every now and then, and every guy on his hard hat has an inspection tag that gets checked off once a month. So all this stuff is part of the bigger picture. Um, when you're working on a multi-employer job site, I did some training for a guy. They lost on their job sites alone in the Washington, D.C. area. They had 6 people die. They're all over safety and they still have problems. So, we need to be careful of what we're doing. Now, there are things to consider. Every company has to have a safety plan. You need a company safety plan and then a site-specific safety plan. Company safety plans have certain characteristics, covers everything you do, okay? But your site-specific plan has hazard communication, fall protection equipment, a fall prevention plan, a rescue plan. It's not something that's in here, it's a little bit later, all right? But your site-specific plan has to have a fallen worker rescue plan. What happens if a guy falls? The right solution sometimes is you call 911, but it may not be the only solution, and it may not be the most immediate solution. So you need to go through the process of a job hazard analysis. The details of a hazard analysis are here. We have forms that we can give you for this as well, if you're interested. And when you're doing the hazard analysis, you need to list and rank and prioritize the hazards. Then when you've done the analysis before you start the job, you have to sit down with everybody and say, this is what's going on. And it may be a 30-minute toolbox talk on day one rather than a 10-minute toolbox talk. Everybody walks on a roofing job and thinks it's all the same thing day in, day out. And guess what? Sometimes it is, but the one time it's not the same thing day in, day out, so the one time somebody's gonna get hurt. If you're a residential roofing contractor, you need to have a site safety plan for every house that you do. If you're a residential guy, it can be exactly the same plan every time, but you have to have the name and address of that job on every plan. It has to be in the file for that particular project. Now, fallen worker rescue plans. These are probably the most important thing. If somebody does fall, what are we going to do? This is where having everybody on the same page gets to be important. Now, emergency phone numbers, you have to have the exact address for the job. If the guy that falls off the roof is the guy that drove the truck with the rest of the crew sleeping in the back, then somebody in the rest of the crew needs to know exactly where they're at. And anybody that falls, and I'm referring to personal fall arrest systems, anybody that falls has to go to the hospital, because the suspension trauma from a person who's fallen and then been rescued can appear hours and hours later. When we're talking about documentation, names, weather conditions, the safety plan changes, daily safety precautions, you want to document your toolbox talks, you want to document daily equipment inspections, and then monthly equipment inspections, and then entering injuries, accidents, and any call to 911. And a 911 call is automatically a reason for an OSHA inspector to come in and visit your job if he's aware of the fact that somebody called 911. So, and the checklists are important. Not every checklist includes everything. I encourage you to find one, look at it, modify it so that it's appropriate for your company, and then just have your guys every day, first thing in the morning, fill out the checklist. If they're doing a torch job, there's additional things. If it's a hot air welding job, that's different. EPDM, they're different. You might want one for each type of system they're doing. If it's 4 and 12 and above, which is a steep slope roof, under OSHA standards, 4 and 12 and above, you may have a separate checklist for that as well. Now, I think we have a question here. I can send, yes, Stephen, I can send a copy of these checklists out to you, okay? The project documentation. You want to take care of all the administrative things as a company. That's one set of documentation. The other set of documentation is the things that you do on the job. This is filled out by your project manager every day or your foreman every day. When we put this daily inspection together for the CERTA program, it has a pre-start safety inspection. Walking working surfaces, perimeters, ladders, PPE, all of those items. And I would like to say the downside of working from home is sometimes I cannot control when my neighbors cut the grass. I apologize for that. Okay? I've referred to this a couple of times before, and it's the hierarchy of controls. The reason that this is important is this. As an employer, this hierarchy of controls is written into the OSHA law. That means the first thing you should do, especially with fall prevention, is if you can eliminate it, you eliminate it. Simple. Don't go on the roof. Well, we can't do that. Can we make a substitute for it? Many times, no, we cannot make a substitute for it. Engineering controls, isolating people, isolating people from the hazard. Yeah, we can do that. Okay, an engineering control that isolates people from the hazard is a perimeter fall prevention system. Guardrails, cables. It is not the last system that you're allowed to use, which is PPE, or a personal fall arrest system. First, you're supposed to be using an engineering control, then an administrative control, like a controlled access zone. And a warning line is a controlled access zone, or you can create a controlled access zone around the perimeter of a building. And then the last thing they want you to use is PPE of any type. That's harness, lifeline, horizontal lifelines. That's all the way at the bottom of the list of things that you should be selecting, not the first thing that you go to when you're looking to prepare a job in terms of setting it up for fall prevention. It's unfortunate because, you know, sometimes it requires more of an investment. Some guys have it, some guys don't. If you don't have it and you're finding that there's difficulty with compliance from your guys, I mean, I honestly, I work with residential roofers. They can't get their guys to tie off, you know, to save their lives. And the reality is they're all wrong. They should be erecting guardrail systems. Well, that makes me uncompetitive. My competitor doesn't do that. That's on him when his guys die. Does it make you uncompetitive? It might, but it's still something that's the right way for you to consider, and we have the obligation to tell you that this is the order of things and this is what comes first. Okay? The last time I did one of these kinds of presentations live, they practically started a fight in the audience. And I was telling Megan Miller about that before you guys came on. It's not fair, because there are guys that will not respect that there is a hierarchy of controls that we're obligated to follow. Now, a couple of notes about Latino workers. 2 out of every 3 Latino workers that die on construction projects are born outside of the United States. Why do they die? It's because they don't understand what they're being told to do. Actually, the statistics support Spanish language training. Latino workers are a large part of our industry now, and we need to just accept and acknowledge that. If you're going to hire them, you need to hire them and treat them the right way. Because if they get hurt on your job, or if they die on your job for whatever reason, if this happens, it not only affects your company, but it affects all the guys that work around them. It affects the worker's family. It affects every single person in the chain. And simply making sure a guy understands what he's supposed to do in a language that he understands. It's not just the fair thing to do, it's the right thing to do. And, you know, we can all debate the merits of, you know, Spanish workers or not Spanish workers, but depending upon where you are, if you go into Chicago, you go into Texas, you go in up and down the East Coast, Florida, California, there's Spanish-speaking workers everywhere. And we know that they're intelligent guys, they're hard workers, and, you know, regardless of how they got here, by the way, immigration status is not a factor in the application of OSHA laws. If a guy's not here legally, that doesn't relieve anybody from their responsibilities under the labor laws. OSHA is blind when it comes to that. And I say that because of this. Anybody that files a complaint can do so anonymously. He doesn't have to show who he is. He doesn't have to have an identification or have a taxpayer identification number to file an OSHA complaint. And if you've got a crew of guys on your job, you need to make sure that nobody's in the street calling up and you know, saying these guys are not being treated fairly. The reality is that you are equally responsible for every person that steps onto your job site. Now, the last two things here are this. Looks like I brought it in right at about an hour. Injuries cost $130 billion a year every year. Okay? It hasn't gone down, it's gone up. The more people we have, the more money that gets spent related to injuries. Maybe the percentage of people getting injured is declining, but as the population grows, if the population grows faster than the rate of increase of people getting hurt, then they say that that's a decline in the number of people getting hurt. It's actually a decline in the percentage, not a decline in the number. So the implementation of a good safety plan reduces workers' comp costs, lowers direct and indirect expenses. It makes you more profitable in a number of ways, not including happy employees, because if they feel better, then they work better. And more importantly, your employees are able to go home safe, uninjured, provide for their families, come back to work the next day, and continue to help your company grow. Now, in closing, if you need additional help about any of this, the Midwest Roofing Contractors Association can help you. Your workers' comp carrier can help you. Your attorney and any safety consultant that's worth his salt can help you. Or you can contact OSHA directly. They have outreach programs where they will come and essentially give you amnesty. They will come in, look at everything you do, tell you what you need to fix to bring it up to their standard, and they will give you amnesty on anything that's wrong today. And then going forward, you know, you will have participated proactively in their programs, and if something happens, they know and are familiar with you. You know, these guys work a territory. And I know I have cousins that work for a large general contracting firm. They have Connecticut OSHA in there about once every 6 months. They look at everything. It's no charge, and it basically helps them be a better company. So, while none of this is intended to be all-inclusive, it is intended to provide you the fundamental information. Again, consult with whoever you use for more specific information. And if you have any questions, my contact information is available. We can open this up to questions now if anybody has them. And I think Megan can provide access to the documents that we had and this presentation. Anybody got any questions for now? No? I think we're good then. Okay? Anything else, Megan?
Yes. I just wanted to thank you for an excellent session, Chris. And again, if you guys have any questions for Chris, you can email those to Morgan. And I've got her email up on the screen here, and she's going to get them over to Chris. Before we go, I've got a few housekeeping items. The applications for the Elite Safety Program Awards are now being accepted. So you can submit that application online at mrca.org in the Sharp Plus Safety section. So I've got a little screenshot here to show you our homepage. You just click on that Sharp Plus menu, and the drop down you'll find the Safety Program Award. Submitting your application is mandatory. It's a mandatory part of the Sharp Plus Safety certification. Jack from our office will be emailing each of you a promo code to use when you apply, so that you do not have to pay that $500 application fee. So keep an eye out for that email from him. If you have any questions about the application or the code or anything, you can contact Morgan or you can contact me here at the office. So this wraps up our 2021 webinar series, but we will be having 2 additional live sessions at our conference in November that you can attend and receive credit towards your certification. Those sessions will also be recorded and will be accessible online if you're unable to attend the Milwaukee Conference and Expo. So that concludes our session today, and thank you everyone for your participation, and we hope to see you at conference.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Anytime.